Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Joseph Forgas and I'm going to do the lectures in social psychology in this course. I really hope you will enjoy them. Social psychology is probably the most interesting field of psychology, at least I think so, and I hope I'll be able to convey some of that excitement and interest to you during the course that we'll do together. This first lecture is about Introduction to Social Psychology as a Science, and we are also going to discuss the nature of human sociability. Throughout the lecture, on the slides, there will be a number of embedded links to reading and also videos on the internet, which you are welcome to look at. They are related to the lecture material and they expand on particular topics that we are discussing. We might as well begin. In this course, we are going to focus on the social psychology of interpersonal behavior. In other words, those aspects of social psychology that directly deal with how human beings perceive each other, form impression, make inferences, and communicate verbally and non-verbally in social situations. Social psychology is a field that deals with the kind of topics that most of us are naturally fascinated by. How do people interact with each other? How do we get to know people? How do we influence each other? How do we communicate? How do we form attitudes and impressions and so on? So social psychology is an intrinsically interesting field and probably that part of psychology which is most directly relevant to understanding everyday life. These lectures in particular have a purpose. I was hoping to persuade you that studying social psychology is an excellent way to develop a critical, skeptical, scientific attitude towards understanding everyday life that we live in anyway, but usually we do not employ rational, analytical thinking to understand it. These lectures will cover the following major topics. The first two lectures will look at Introduction to Social Psychology and the nature of human sociability. What kind of social animals is or are we, Homo sapiens? The next lectures will look at social perception and cognition. How do we perceive each other? How do we form impressions? The next two lectures will look at the psychology of inferences and attributions. How do we go about understanding other people and figuring out the causes of their behavior? And finally, the last two lectures will look at interpersonal communication, the use of language and nonverbal communication to relate to each other. Throughout the lectures, I'm going to emphasize real-life issues, the way scientific research helps to illuminate everyday phenomena. During the lectures and as part of the slides, I will also include a number of links to various videos and additional readings. I strongly encourage you to click on those links and watch the videos to deepen your understanding of a particular topic. And finally, at the end of the slides to this lecture, you will be given a number of links to very interesting slides on YouTube about issues which are directly relevant to social psychology. These are prepared by a website called School of Life, and they're fascinating videos. I strongly recommend that you look at many of them as you can. So let's start with a question of definition. What is social psychology? How can we define our field? Every textbook contains a definition, but here are two selected almost at random. Barenboim and Salz define social psychology as the scientific field that seeks to understand the nature and causes of individual behavior in social situations. And David Myers, whose face picture you can see on the upper right-hand corner, he's the author of probably the most popular and most widely published social psychology textbook, defines social psychology as the scientific study of how people think about, influence, and relate to each other. So if you look at the key features in these definitions of social psychology, three things stand out. Firstly, The unit of analysis for social psychology is the individual. We study how individuals think about, behave, and relate to each other. The second key topic is a commitment to the scientific method. We use the scientific method to study, analyze, and understand social behavior. And the third communality in this definition is that social psychology includes both mental as well as behavioral phenomena. Social behavior is not just when you actually behave in a situation where other people are present. Much social psychology deals with mental phenomena, thinking about, planning, imagining different social situations and how you're going to behave in them. To illustrate these points, here is a simple thought experiment. Imagine that you are alone in your bathroom in the morning as you're getting ready for your day, and you're thinking about what should you wear today, which clothes you should put on. And then you remember that you're going to meet your boyfriend or your girlfriend later in the afternoon. And as a result of that thought, you decide to wear a cloth or something that you consider to be particularly attractive. Now, in this entire situation, you are alone. It's a solitary situation in your bathroom. And yet, the thinking, what am I going to wear, is social psychology. It's imagining, mentally rehearsing a social situation and deciding how you're going to behave in that situation. If you take it that way, then much of your everyday life, much of your thinking is actually social thinking. We think about social behavior in the company of other people, even if you happen to be alone at the time. Understanding the social world is the major purpose of social psychology and one of the main benefits of studying social psychology. Human beings are immensely curious creatures. We want to figure out, understand everything around us. The study of social psychology is basically driven by curiosity, a desire to know how people behave, why they behave that way, how we can understand it. This curiosity has to be balanced by a high degree of skepticism, critical faculties. That's not something you are born with. Critical faculty, skepticism, the scientific attitude must be learned. Unless you develop skepticism and your critical faculties, you are going to be gullible. You are going to believe information which is not true. Gullibility continues to be a very important phenomenon in modern life. Many people believe in fake news, in urban myth, marketing claims, and often manipulative lies that they receive from advertisers, politicians, and other people who want to influence them. To be skeptical is in some ways the highest value for a thinking human being. For a skeptic, all beliefs that are not supported by evidence should be questioned. It's a very important point to remember. At the bottom of the slide, you will find links to a number of interesting videos which speak to the question of human gullibility. Of course, understanding human nature and understanding human social behavior has been of interest for many hundreds of years. There are several disciplines which inform social psychology and which are still relevant to us today. For example, philosophy, including the works of Plato and Aristotle, have much to say about the human condition. History is very important to us because by studying history, we can try to understand human social behavior in the past. Evolutionary theory is also very relevant because human beings and the behavior of human beings has been shaped by evolutionary pressures, adaptation pressures, over many tens of thousands of years. And anthropology is another field which compares the social systems and social behaviors of different human groups, is also highly relevant to us. In these lectures, I will try to draw on information from a variety of disciplines to illuminate the nature of human sociability. As I mentioned, the history of social psychology is recent, 120 years old or so. The question social psychologists always ask is, what is human nature like? How can we understand the social behavior of humans? In social philosophy, Plato and Aristotle and most philosophers since then have been speculating about that. The most common philosophical answer to this question has been in terms of what's called simple and sovereign theories. They are simple because a single principle is proposed to explain all of human behavior, and sovereign because that one principle is supposed to explain everything. And here is a number of those simple and sovereign theories that philosophers advocated. Hedonism is the idea that human behavior can be understood in terms of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Many psychological theories, including reinforcement theory, are essentially hedonistic theories at heart. Altruism is the simple and sovereign principle that human beings are naturally inclined to be altruistic, cooperative, and kind to each other, and that's the defining feature of human social life. Rationalism is a 19th century idea that argues that human beings carefully weigh the pluses and the minuses, the benefits and the disbenefits of different actions rationally, and we can understand their social behavior in those terms. Stoicism is a very interesting philosophy that has its equivalent in Eastern philosophy, and this is the idea that human life is essentially difficult, painful, cruel, and meaningless. And so what human beings have to do is to accept this as given and try to make the best of it. You might find Stoicism an interesting philosophy to look at and to read. In particular, the School of Life videos, which I mentioned already and which I will mention at the end of the lectures, contain a number of really interesting 5-10 minute videos about Stoic philosophers, and I would encourage you at the end of this lecture to look them up. Philosophers like Marcus Aurelius and Epicurus are good examples, Seneca, of Stoic philosophy, if you haven't come across it before. Now, just as social psychology is informed by various other disciplines that have important news to tell us about human social behavior, social psychology is also the foundation discipline for many other fields in the social sciences and the humanities. Economics, politics, criminology, sociology, anthropology, legal studies, they all rely on knowledge which is partly derived from social psychological studies. In fact, if you take one example, economics, which is the science of how people make decisions in the marketplace, decision making is the domain of social psychological research, and the only social psychologist who got a Nobel Prize so far, Daniel Kahneman, actually got a Nobel Prize in economics as a result of his work on human decision-making processes. So social psychology is the foundation of many other fields. The history of social psychology is kind of interesting. It's, as I said, only started in the late 1890s. The most explosive period of growth is in 1960s and afterwards, when the scientific method has taken root and the number of social psychology departments and social psychology researchers has multiplied. It's important to note that the science of social psychology is a uniquely Western product. It's the product of Western civilization. No other civilization has led to the development of scientific social psychology. And there is a reason for that. It is the Western traditions of individualism, enlightenment, empiricism, and rationalism which combine to the establishment of the social sciences in general and social psychology in particular. Of course, Eastern philosophy has much to say about the human condition and social behavior, but these ideas have remained speculative and philosophical and did not produce a scientific enterprise, as is the case with Western scientific social psychology. On a slightly more depressing note, you might wonder, why is it that it is Western civilization that produced social psychology? One possible intriguing idea is that it is only in Western civilization that human beings find themselves in social situations which they experience as problematic. If we want to understand our social nature, and especially if we feel lonely, isolated, shy, and in some ways cut off from other people, which Western civilization seems to be typical of, then perhaps studying social behavior is a necessary response to understand this. Social psychology is the scientific study of social behavior, but of course all of us living in society already have a lot of common sense knowledge about how people behave. In a sense, we are all practicing social psychologists. We possess a lot of everyday knowledge about the social world. The problem is that a lot of common sense knowledge is non-specific, vague, and untestable. In fact, everything and the opposite of everything can be true some of the time. Common sense wisdom, as illustrated by Proverbs, tells us that any claim that is plausible can be juxtaposed to another claim which claims the opposite. Out of sight is out of mind, true. On the other hand, absence makes the heart grow fonder, also true. What we don't know, which is true, when, and why. This is why we need a scientific study of social behavior that goes beyond common sense understanding. On this slide, you will find a number of claims, statements, which do appear to be true when you first read it. They kind of agree with our common sense understanding. And yet, each and every one of them turns out to be false as a result of scientific research. It's a nice illustration of how common sense knowledge is very different and often incorrect compared to scientific understanding. Social psychological research also can often tell us facts which common sense would not have supported. This is an example of an experiment that we have carried out at this university, where we tested the prediction that good or bad mood caused by good or bad weather has an influence on people's memories. The study was done in the Randwick shopping mall, not far from here, in a news agency. And what we did is check people's memories for different objects left in the shop on days when they were in a bad mood, because the weather was bad, and on days when they were in a good mood, because the weather was good. As you can see on the figure, people in a negative mood on rainy weathers had significantly better recollection, significantly better memory of details of objects which they have seen in the shop. And as it turns out, this confirms some interesting theories about the relationship between moods and human thinking and memory. This is not something that common sense would ever lead you to believe or to assume. It's a non-obvious finding, illustrating that psychological methods can give us understanding and knowledge that is not accessible to common sense. And of course, you don't have far to go to find examples of incorrect common sense beliefs. They are everywhere. The human intuition is often mistaken in finding connections and assuming causality where there isn't any. Common sense knowledge is often wrong because it cannot distinguish between coincidence, correlation, and causality. Only scientific methods can do that. A lot of anecdotal knowledge is actually unsubstantiated. If you assume that your own aunt drank herbal tea and got better because of it, you're almost certainly mistaken, because most people get well even without drinking a herbal tea. It's a good case of a causal misattribution. And there are many examples of common sense misbeliefs in everyday life. Alternative therapies, homeopathy, anecdotal evidence for cures, a lot of the dieting information and so on, are all examples of common sense knowledge that is actually wrong, mistaken issues. Now, I emphasized already that social psychology is a science. What does it exactly mean? But the scientific method is a very complex set of requirements, methods, and routines. Essentially, it requires an attitude of skepticism on the part of the scientist, a questioning attitude. It requires due attention to the importance of replicability. If you make a claim about a cause-effect relationship, it's important that it can be reliably replicated. In order to do that, we need measurement. It's not enough to voice an opinion or an evaluation. You really have to have objective, measurable, quantitative data to back up your claims. And objectivity, this is the idea that your subjective values and opinions should be put aside when you do science. You rely on facts to draw conclusions and to establish causality. Now, all of this seems fairly intuitive and obvious until you consider that within Western social sciences, there is a very interesting movement which denies, questions the validity of the scientific method. These ideas generally go under the name of postmodernism or deconstructionism or critical theory, a whole variety of social science ideas which fundamentally argue that facts are not available and that all we are dealing with is opinions, and therefore objective science is simply not possible. So let's say a few words about this postmodernism ideology. Postmodernism is a relatively recent development in the social sciences and humanities. This is an orientation that claims that truth is unattainable, science doesn't work any better than many other ways of understanding reality, and instead of looking for truth, what we should ask is whose interest a particular piece of knowledge really serves. Now, this is a completely, in some ways, crazy ideology. It was put forward by some French thinkers like Foucault and Derrida, and it generated a literature which is practically incomprehensible. Alan Sokar, a physicist, published a paper in one of the postmodernist journals which was intentionally written to be complete nonsense. Nevertheless, that paper was happily accepted and published in this postmodernist paper. There are also websites, there is one on this slide you can click on, which will generate postmodernist verbiage which looks as if it was a scientific paper, even though it's completely impossible to understand. It's nonsense, it's garbage generated by a computer. So the idea that postmodernism can supplant science is essentially nonsensical. It is based on the basic misunderstanding of science. And the simple argument against postmodernism is an obvious one. Only science really works. If you look around you, everything, all the human artifacts have been created by one and only one way of thinking, and that is the scientific way of thinking. Every other way of understanding reality is not a proper and truthful representation of the nature of reality. I strongly recommend that you listen to the short video talks by Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson. The links are provided at the bottom of this slide. So as I mentioned previously, the best argument in support of science and against postmodernism is that all human civilizations, all the achievements of the human race are the products of one and only one system of knowledge, and that's the scientific system of knowledge. Of course, throughout history, human groups have believed many other theories, superstition, religion, mythology. Even today, many believe in things like homeopathy or acupuncture, Chinese medicine. These are all non-scientific systems of understanding, and they do not work in the sense that they cannot be shown to produce the desired results. Now next, I'd like to move on to the next big topic that we're going to cover, and that's the nature of human sociability. Humans are profoundly social creatures. To understand that, just think of a short mind experiment. What would it be like if you were the only person alive on Earth? It would be an unrecognizable experience. You would not have language, you would have no symbols, you would have no consensual understanding of reality. Really, you would not be a recognizable human being the way we understand it. Humans are sociable, and it is sociability that makes us the kind of creatures we really are. There's lots of evidence indicating that when humans are deprived of social interaction, when they find themselves alone, the consequences are disastrous. Abandoned children, hermits, people who are shipwrecked or suffer some misfortune usually report extremely serious reactions which are rather similar to the kind of paranoid schizophrenic states that individuals experience when their understanding and link to reality is completely destroyed. Of course, we cannot do experiments on isolation. It would be unethical. But Stanley Schachter, a social psychologist, did try to figure out how long people can stand voluntary isolation. In his studies, he found that there are huge individual differences. Some people cannot stand being isolated in a room for more than 20 minutes. Others seem to be quite comfortable even for several hours or several days. So in a profound way, the amount of social stimulation or contact we need seems to be very different across individuals, but we can say that all human beings need social contact for normal life and normal adjustment. So sociability is incredibly important, and isolation has very negative consequences. If you are isolated from birth, it tends to be irreversible. If you're isolated temporarily, the symptoms tend to be similar to psychotic states, hallucinations, and so on. Empirical studies also show that humans are intensely social creatures. This is a survey simply looking at how much time adolescents and adults spend in the company of others as against alone. And as you find at the bottom of the graph, adolescents spend about 74% of their waking hours in the company of others, and adults about 70.9%. In other words, humans are so intensely social that they spend about 3/4 of their time not alone, but with other people. So you might ask the question, how do we explain this intense need for sociability? There are a number of theories. I will mention only 4 of them. Evolutionary theories argue that we are sociable because we have been naturally selected to be sociable. All our forebears, many generations backwards, had to be highly sociable to survive. In other words, sociability is an adaptive resource that makes it more likely that sociable people survive compared to antisocial people. So it's not surprising that sociability becomes a general trait in the human population. Reinforcement is another theory that proposes that humans are sociable because we get positive reinforcement from other humans. From the moment of your birth, your mother, your family, and others will give you positive reinforcement, and so you become sociable. The problem with this theory is that people are often sociable in ways that has never been reinforced. We seek the company of others, we explore, we want to be in social situations, even if we never experience that situation, and even if we never have been reinforced in that situation. Social comparison is another theory for sociability, and it basically argues that only by comparing yourself, your ideas, your behavior with other people can you have any sense of reality. Think back of the thought experiment of being alone in the world. If you were alone in the world, all of your behaviors would be equally acceptable or unacceptable. Only when there are other people around you can you figure out what works, what doesn't work, what's right, what's wrong. So social comparison is the idea that we need other people to develop a coherent, consensual worldview which is shared by others. If others don't agree with us in our thinking, we are going to be mentally ill, in effect. Agreement with others, which comes by social comparison, is the foundation of social communality. And finally, social exchange theory predicts that sociability is so common because uniquely, by interacting with other people, both individuals can produce greater benefits to themselves than the cost of the interaction. This is a kind of marketplace model of sociability. By interacting, both individuals can be deriving benefits. For example, if you have a friend David, and David is a very sociable, outgoing, popular person. You, on the other hand, are a good student, but fairly lonely. If you interact with David, you can both benefit. You can go to parties with David because he gets invited, and David gets help from you to write his essays. So both of you can provide a resource to each other, which is more valuable to the other person than the cost to yourself. Sociability, as I mentioned, is likely to have very strong evolutionary roots. One interesting line of evidence for this is the relatively explosive, very sudden development of the human brain. As you can see on the graph on the left-hand side, the growth in the size of the human brain has taken an exponential growth curve in the last 1 million years or so. And that suggests that there may be a relationship between the evolution of the human brain and the increasingly complex sociability of human beings. If you're interested in evolutionary social psychology and how human beings evolved, I strongly recommend that you look at a book by Bill von Hippel. He used to be here at the University of New South Wales and he's now at Queensland University, who wrote a best-selling book on the evolution of social behavior called The Social Leap. You can find out details by clicking at this link. Now, the idea that the brain and sociability are closely connected has received some very strong support in recent years. The idea is that you need a big brain, very complex cognitive capacities, simply to coordinate social behavior. The more sophisticated the social life of a group, the larger the brain that they need for managing this. In other words, it is the demands of managing social relationships that seems to drive the development of the human brain. Adolf, in this link, has talked very interestingly about how the brain deals with social information. Robin Dunbar, a biologist at Oxford University, proposed what is now called the social brain hypothesis. Dunbar looked at the size of the average group in different primates on the left-hand axis of this figure and the size of the neocortex of the different primates. And what he found was a very strong linear relationship. The larger the group in which a primate lives, the larger the neocortex of that particular species. And that supports the idea that a large brain primarily serves the demands of complex sociability and social interaction. Dunbar also argued that for humans, the group size that our brain is equipped to deal with is about 150 people. That's sometimes called Dunbar's number, and you can click on that link and hear talk about that. Dunbar showed that if you look at over human history, 150 seems to be the typical size of basic human groups. Roman legions had 150 people in their basic military unit, and that's still the case today. Most hunting-gathering tribes have about 150 people in them. Feudal villages are usually about 150 people. And even in modern-day Britain, when you look at the number of social contacts that people maintain, for example, by analyzing the number of people they reach by sending Christmas cards, that turns out to be about 150. And watch this. If you look at Facebook relationships, Dunbar found that most people have about 120 to 150 active Facebook relationships. This seems to be the magic number that the human brain is capable of remembering, integrating, and interacting with. So if human social behavior has such a strong biological and evolutionary determination, an interesting question arises. How flexible is our social behavior? We tend to think that humans are somehow a class apart from the animal kingdom. We have consciousness, we have intelligence, and we tend to infer that because of that, we can change our social behavior at will. Social behavior should be very flexible and very changeable. On the other hand, as we have seen, evolutionary influences play an important role in the development of human sociability. This is a really important question because if you want to change human behavior and you take a nurture perspective, in other words, you believe that you simply change the rules, you change the norms, and people can behave accordingly, then you assume complete behavioral flexibility. Social engineering, the idea that we can do anything we like by getting people to behave differently, is based on the assumption of complete behavioral flexibility. If, on the other hand, human behavior is partly determined by biological evolutionary factors, then we cannot change behavior at will. Then there are limits that we cannot transgress. So how do we find out the answer to this question? How flexible is our behavior? We can study changes in human social behavior over time by looking at history, and we look at changes in human social behavior across cultures by looking at anthropology. So let's look at this now. When we look at changes in human social behavior over time, a number of people, especially Steven Pinker, who wrote a fantastic book entitled The Better Angels of Our Nature, and I gave you a link here, argues that if you look at the change in Western civilization from about 1300 to the current time, what you see an amazing, dramatic, unprecedented change as far as violence, aggression, and human freedom is concerned. Western cultures have become immensely much less violent, much more tolerant, much more free, and much more rational. So there is evidence from history that some basic aspects of human nature, like violence and aggression, can change over time if the civilization makes it necessary. Please look at the video, How Social Life Changed Over Time, and have a look at Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. Now let's look at anthropology, comparing behavior across cultures. A classic example here is Margaret Mead, perhaps the most famous anthropologist of the 20th century, who set out in the 1920s to do fieldwork in Samoa with the express intention to prove that Western norms of sexuality, adolescence, and social behavior are not universal and that other cultures behave very differently. She spent some months in Western Samoa. She never learned a language, and she spoke to a number of female informants, and asked them about how Samoans live. And based on this information, she wrote a best-selling book called Coming of Age of Samoa, in which she basically argued that Western norms of sexuality, of adolescence, of violence, are totally arbitrary, because here is another culture, Samoa, which is totally different. People have no hang-ups about sexuality, they don't care about virginity, they don't care about premarital sex, they're much less violent, adolescents naturally grow up to be adults without any stresses, and so on. This book, The Coming of Age of Samoa, became the best-selling book in anthropology ever, and it had a huge cultural effect. As a result of that book, Western social scientists believed that anything can be changed. We can change our culture whichever way we like. There is nothing preordained about the cultural habits in our civilization. If Western norms are arbitrary, then we can change our habits on sexuality. This led eventually to sexual liberation. The relationship between the two sexes or genders can be revised. That led to feminism. All gender roles are negotiable. That ultimately led to current ideas that gender is a social construct and has nothing to do with biology. Margaret Mead herself lived according to this value system. She had female sexual partners as well as a multiplicity of male sexual partners, believing that the Western norms simply don't apply and can be easily transgressed. So Margaret Mead described Samoan society as a kind of ideal South Pacific paradise where there are no sexual taboos, there is little delinquency, violence, or suicide. Unfortunately, it turns out that an Australian anthropologist, Derek Freeman, went back to Samoa later and studied Samoan society in much greater detail than Margaret Mead. He learned the language and he stayed there for much longer than Margaret Mead did. And what he found was exactly the opposite of what Margaret Mead reported. Derek Freeman reported that Samoan society is plagued by severe sexual taboos, delinquency, violence, and suicide. So, how could that be? Freeman showed that Mead was misinformed by the few women she asked for information who felt so embarrassed by her questions that they gave her the answers that she was looking for. It's interesting that Derek Freeman's book, a much more detailed and better documented report on Samoan society, was actually condemned by the anthropological community because they also did not want to hear what Freeman had to say. There are some interesting implications as a result of this controversy. It turns out that some social behaviors, such as aggression and violence at a social level, can probably be decreased as civilizations become more sophisticated. On the other hand, other behaviors like mating behaviors, sexual behaviors appear to be universal across different cultures. And that suggests that there are some biological and evolutionary factors which play a role in some aspects of human behavior. It turns out that biological sex might actually matter in determining how people behave because all cultures seem to show similarities. There are interesting contemporary controversies about the biological determination. For example, some theorists claim that sexuality and gender behavior are socially determined on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, homosexuality may be determined by genetic or other biological factors. These sorts of issues are hotly debated at the moment, and what they suggest is that we need to be very careful in not confusing facts with ideology. What is the case with what we would like to be the case for various social reasons. So, looking at the anthropological evidence, and in particularly the Mead-Freeman controversy, there seem to be some indications that some classes of social behaviors, particularly social behaviors that relate to male-female behavior, mating behavior, relationship behaviors might be influenced by evolutionary factors which are still with us today. David Buss, a social psychologist, has collected a lot of data analyzing, for example, mating ads and surveying sexual preferences, documenting the fact that even today, men typically are more promiscuous, more interested in casual sex, and more likely to be the seekers in establishing relationships. Women, on the other hand, tend to be more cautious, less interested in casual sex, and more likely to be the choosers in relationships. It is especially interesting that these differences endure despite the fact that we now live in a very different environment than our Stone Age ancestors. We now have widely available contraception, for example, so falling pregnant is not a danger having a sexual contact. We have social norms which encourage or allow far more sexual liberty than in previous periods. And yet, despite these fundamental changes, there is a lot of evidence that male-female differences in relationship behaviors, mating preferences, and sexuality continue to be very similar to the way they have been in previous periods, which indicates that we might be dealing with an evolutionarily determined behavioral pattern. So, for example, Clark and Hatfield in 1989 showed that men are far more willing and prepared to engage in casual sex than are women. In this study, men and women were faced with the question whether they would be willing to go out with each other, to go up to the other person's apartment, or go to bed with the other person. And as you can see, men were far more willing to go up to the apartment and go to bed. In fact, no women agreed to go to bed in such a casual situation. This again illustrates that the differences in sexual behavior of men and women endure despite the wide availability of contraception. Male-female differences are also very marked if you look at the number of sexual partners expected or desired by men and women. According to the study by Buss and Schmidt, 1993, over all time periods, men expect and desire more sexual partners than do women. Men and women also demonstrate different patterns of jealousy. Men are far more concerned about sexual infidelity in their partners, and females are far more concerned about emotional infidelity. Now, how can we explain these really clear differences between the sexual behavior and mating behavior of men and women? Robert Trivers suggested a theory called parental investment theory that goes some ways towards explaining the different behavior of males and females when it comes to selecting sexual partners. According to Trivers, the higher investing sex, which in humans happens to be the female, will be the choosier, causing the opposite sex, the male, to be more competitive in pursuing it. To put it simply, men seek to propagate widely and women seek to propagate wisely because propagation, sexuality, reproduction for women is much more costly. It involves a lengthy period of gestation and a lengthy period of a dependent infant. So for women, engaging in reproductive behavior is potentially risky, and they will be much more selective and cautious, careful in selecting a mate. Men. So this is a summary of this theory, parental investment theory. For males, reproduction involves minimal investment of time, energy, and risk. As a result, males can maximize their reproductive success by seeking more sexual partners with high reproductive potential. And in terms of behavior, this means that men have more interest in uncommitted sex, greater number of sex partners over their lifetime. They look for youth and attractiveness in their partners. Women, on the other hand, have a reproductive biology which involves substantial investment and cost in time, energy, and risk. As a result, women tend to maximize their reproductive success by being selective and seeking partners who are willing to invest material resources and time in caring for them and their offspring. As a result, women are less interested in uncommitted sex, they have smaller number of sex partners over their lifetime, and they tend to look for income status and ambition in their potential partners. So, just to sum it up, in this lecture we looked at the nature of social psychology, its definition, history, principles, how it's different from common sense, and social psychology as a science. Then we moved on to discussing the nature of human sociability. We looked at the question of behavioral flexibility, historical changes in social behavior, and the role of evolutionary influences in various kinds of social behavior. In particular, at the end of the lecture, we looked at sex differences in male and female mating behaviors, a fascinating illustration of how these deeply ingrained evolutionary differences endure despite the fact that now there is widespread availability of contraception, so women no longer risk pregnancy as a result of sexual activity, and the social norms have also changed fundamentally, and yet male and female differences remain fairly stable, consistent with the idea that this is an evolutionary difference. We are going to continue in the lecture on human sociability, and I also encourage you to look at the School of Life videos on the following pages. Just click on any of the links and enjoy.